that would compel the Beijing government, the hope was they would compel the Beijing government to finally grant Hong Kong rights for free elections that were not supervised or in any way manipulated by Beijing. I do not grow up there, and I don't have Alex's breadth, but what I do have is some aspect of really digging down into what the rights are in Hong Kong as people understand them to be, and how those rights have been curtailed, often in legal ways. This is similar to, if anyone has followed what's happened in Russia and in Venezuela, a bit in Egypt, definitely in Poland and Hungary. The government has used legal means, using the Constitution, to then curtail or change and limit in certain ways either the opposition movement or the understanding and interpretation of rights, and therefore limited the rights. And sometimes people have been caught up in the middle of that, which is what we're seeing now in Hong Kong. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not from the common law tradition, which is what they practice there. So a lot of this has been kind of learning and figuring out how this, why this seems so different from British law and why it seems so different from American law. I'll do my best to explain in a user-friendly way. But so what the starting point for understanding Hong Kong is not people in the streets, but it is the fact that they have rights. And can you folks see what I'm going to scroll? Can you see this basic law of the Hong Kong SAR? Is that yes?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, all right. So this was a constitution that was created for Hong Kong, but not by Hong Kongers. This was imposed. There was an agreement between Britain and Beijing. Britain would hand back this colony to China that had been taken in the 1800s during the Opium Wars. And there was the agreement that in 1997, Hong Kong would revert to China or move to China, depending on your interpretation, and they would have a constitution that in some ways reflected the rights they had as a colony. It's important to know that Hong Kongers never got to vote on this. This was never the subject of public hearings. People like Alex were born under one country, and at the stroke of midnight in 1997, Alex suddenly became a member of the PRC. And that's true with millions of people there, millions of people who have left. So it's also known, I've just learned the term now, it's a sub-constitution. So while it has, this document does allow people rights and it stipulates what's allowed and what the government looks like, it's not the preeminent constitution. The Chinese constitution reigns supreme over the Hong Kong one. This constitution replaced what had been kind of like these colonial constitutions, letters of patent, the royal instructions. Hong Kongers didn't have democracy under Britain, and they still don't have democracy. Okay, so the idea of this constitution is that Hong Kong was going to exist as an autonomous unit, not completely autonomous, but they were going to be able to run their own legislature, their own executive, and their own judicial system. And this was an idea that Deng Xiaoping came up with, the one country, two systems principle, and there would be fundamental rights in Hong Kong, different from what the rights are in China. And this is a document that does declare that Hong Kong has a high degree of autonomy. There are a lot of terms like that that hung me up when I started learning about Hong Kong's history. I worked at the SCMP my first year there, and people kept referring, and I know they were referring to terms they had learned about in school, and they kept referring to a Hong Kong way of life. And I kept asking people to describe what they meant by that. Because, you know, coming from America, I was like, I wouldn't even be able to tell you what an American way of life is. And I realized that that is a term that has been used since the time of Margaret Thatcher, that they would retain Hong Kong's way of life. And the problem with those kind of loose terms is that people interpret them differently. So the way Alex sees a Hong Kong way of life is very different from what Regina Ip or Carrie Lam sees as a Hong Kong way of life. And so as the generations have learned and expected more of their government, of their rights, those conflicts about interpretation have spilled out and have become more fraught. So the thing, I'm not going to read all these because that's just awful to read to you, but I'm going to leave this for you, and you can understand that there are stipulated rights. People have the right to protest. They have the right, I'll get into the civil rights, but they have legislative rights. The national laws are not applied in the SAR under the Constitution, except in this one particular Annex 3. They have independent judicial power. Yes, they do wear those wigs. It was a shock. It looks like a British court when you enter it. They operate under common law, so they use case law from the rest of the Commonwealth. The courts and the trials are open. The documents are not so open. All right. So then there's all these articles that seem to make it clear that the Beijing and the central government will have limited involvement or judicious involvement in the Hong Kong government. And I'm not a historian, but my understanding is that some of this was included because this constitution was being written and being revised when the Tiananmen Square massacre occurred. And so many Hong Kongers were leaving. And that had been the case through the 80s. There had been a pretty steady stream of people moving from Hong Kong. They were concerned about the future. And so there were these components included that were designed to calm the residents, stop everybody from panicking, stop the markets from panicking, and therefore stabilize the city. So that China didn't inherit basically a ghost town of very limited worth. Oh, I got ahead of myself. So on top of those kind of structural components, there's also a Bill of Rights. So these were absolutely inserted into this document because of a fear that China would come in 1997 and end the freedoms that Hong Kongers had grown up with. So there are rights to stand for election, to vote, to be able to speak freely, publish freely, demonstrate, and privacy is protected. All that said, things are not enumerated the same way they are in America. So there's a kind of a lot of room for interpretation. And that then becomes subject to different administrations, different judges, and different eras of case law have impacted on Hong Kong. All right, so the other component, which really blew my mind when I first realized it, is that Beijing has the right to intervene in Hong Kong's constitutional affairs. There's this wonderful Article 158 that allows, I'm being facetious, it allows Beijing to then step in and make a ruling. And the idea was when there was an issue in the courts that involved some sort of a national issue that was basically beyond the scope of the Hong Kong courts, they could then seek an interpretation from the legislature in Beijing to figure a way around this, because there are two constitutions operating, but not in the court system. It's strictly the Hong Kong Constitution. This has led to Beijing issuing these papers, rulings, interpretations. And the last one was probably the most problematic because it started, this interpretation in 2016 was concerned oaths of office that were taken for people who were about to join the legislature. They had been elected, and a lot of pro-democracy activists have taken that opportunity when they're swearing in to say something about democracy, something about their hopes for Hong Kong. They have moved away from the script. And some of the, Nathan Law, a duly elected lawmaker, somebody that Alex has worked closely with, commented about Gandhi. And some people have commented about wanting to end the one-party state in China. So Beijing weighs in and says, no, oaths must be sincere, they must be solemn. And that actually was replicated in a Hong Kong court ruling. So everyone is suddenly faced with deciding, well, what is their version of sincere? What is their version of solemn? And that interpretation and the ruling ended up expelling 6 pro-democracy lawmakers. That was a real wake-up call in Hong Kong, that even though people could be elected with a lot of votes by Hong Kongers, Beijing can undo that. The other major intrusion, which is not like an official one in the interpretation sense, but in 2014, before the, or amid the talk about a mass civil rights protest to get free elections, Beijing weighs in with a paper, the white paper, that is basically trying to correct Hong Kong thinking about what they understood their government was. And the very brief interpretation of that is, no, Hong Kong, you are not autonomous. You do take direction from us. And your judges and your public officials must be loyal to us. They must pledge allegiance to the PRC. And for many people, that was the start of, that was, Xi had risen to power, and that was the start of the mass contractions in Hong Kong civil society and governance, or what was allowed in civil society. So that brings us to the national security law. I am not an expert in basic law, and I'm certainly not an expert in national security law, because people are still reading this and digesting it and trying to figure out what these very broad terms are. This was a, I should go backwards. In 2003, Hong Kong's government attempted to pass an article, a law that would allow a treason law to be practiced in Hong Kong. And that would be not treason against Hong Kong, but treason against the PRC. That was halted and withdrawn after mass protests. It was also a year where the legislature was up for election, and it was sort of the year before, and it was clear that they might lose. So the government didn't want that to happen. So after the mass protest in 2019, Beijing at some point was, or amid the, it was probably amid the protest, Beijing was cooking up some sort of law that Hong Kong could not then lobby against, they could not bunge up with filibustering, but a law that would restrict these kind of actions, like invading. This picture is the invasion of the legislature on July 1st, 2019, when young people stormed in, they defaced things, they raised the colonial flag, and this one young man basically read out a manifesto. And this was a demand for democracy, a demand for freedom from Beijing. So what this national security law does is basically supersede the civil rights and any kind of legislative restrictions, limits on policing, on criminal investigations, on warrants, issues of evidence. A lot of this will be done in secret. There will be no right of appeal. There will not be any kind of transparency to the process. People will not likely get warned to come down like happens now. You get letters from the police. Please come down and bring your lawyer. And we are going to discuss with you the criminal case that we have. It'll likely more resemble what happened the other day with, I'm skipping ahead because I think I'm running out of time, but this is Jimmy Lai. He is the founder of Next Digital and the publisher of Apple Daily. And a year after he met with Mike Pence and was pleading for American help against this extradition law, he was arrested and his newsroom was searched. Now he's been released on bail, and a substantial bail. But the government has put people on notice that through this national security law that was not voted on by the Hong Kong legislature or by Hong Kong people, that Beijing will now intervene in issues that are not typically national security purviews. Schools, universities, the media, internet, social organizations. I'm not sure what they mean by that, but it's in there. There's a lot of vague terminology. They don't explain what separatism, subversion, terrorism, collusion, none of these are really well explained. I think a lot of people in America think of terrorism as bombs and mass injuries and threatening people with their lives. And if you read this, and I do urge you to read it, because you'll get a sense of how broad this law is. Terrorism can be basically trashing a subway station. And collusion is very problematic. I was in a forum yesterday, or I was listening to a forum where academics are raising issues. Wait a second, if we're working on a field of research that will be critical of the PRC, let's say their handling of the virus from China and their handling of reporting the early stages of the contagion. And we're working with, say, researchers in Amsterdam, and they're getting funding from the EU. Is that collusion? Are we committing a version of subversion? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. One of the things that it makes clear is that mainland laws will apply to some cases, and the most serious and imminent national security threats could be could be overseen, handled by Beijing. So instead of having the trials that are open, that you can monitor with the guys with the wigs, you're going to have more like this poor gentleman, where they are basically, they're going into a room and they're not allowed to answer for the charges against them. A lot of them don't even have lawyers. These are all done behind closed doors. They often film just the sentencing. Many people expect that there will be certain defendants who are actually going to just be taken directly to China eventually. The last part of the law that has unnerved many people is that it has what's called extraterritorial components, where people who are not even in Hong Kong, haven't been in Hong Kong, could be accused of committing crimes against the SAR and the PRC. And we've seen a threat. Nobody really knows if this is the real thing. There was a story recently that there are warrants or cases out for certain pro-democracy activists who are now abroad. And one of them has been an American citizen for decades, and he hasn't been in Hong Kong. And nobody really understands what exactly the case could be, because how could he be colluding with a foreign force when he is an American? Who's the foreigner at that point? So there are a lot of things that people don't understand. I certainly don't, as a foreigner, a genuine foreigner. And we're all looking to the legal academic world to be able to guide us, because we want that guidance before there are actual criminal cases, security cases brought under this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne, for that presentation. And I guess Alex will work on uploading your presentation materials. So Suzanne, if you could disconnect from the slides, and we'll let Alex.
How did I do? Good work?
Oh, yes, very informative. Let's see if, okay, Alex, can you see if you could upload your slide?
Yep, I think I could upload my slide now. One second.
Okay, there we go. Okay, Alex.
Okay, so you can all see my slides, right?
I can see it.
Okay,
Yes.
great, sounds great. Okay, so thanks, Tom, for inviting, and also thanks, Susanna, for giving us a very good introduction. I'll also be giving an introduction to walk you through the history of Hong Kong in a short version. So that will help us to go into the Q&A section and the dialogue in a much better way. So the picture I show you, this is usually the image that people come into mind when you talk about Hong Kong, like high-rising building, skyline. It's kind of like New York at night when you look at the skyline. So that is the image of Hong Kong, like commercialized city, businesses, financial city. And the government will also use this kind of picture to market Hong Kong, saying, oh, this is Asia's world city, come to invest, come to shop. It is a place for tourism and financial investment. This is a place that you enjoy. So it's like you can see the skyline and the high-rising building. The last year, you start to see like more and more pictures like this, like protesters confronting with the police. And the protesters have been like demanding the government to withdraw the extradition bill that has been briefly mentioned by Susanna. And they also asked the government to start like saying the protesters as rioters. The protesters demand to set up an independent investigation committee to conduct a search on police violence. They also said the government should withdraw all the charges against the protesters, and they want democracy. They want an electoral reform. So what happened? So if you want to like talk about Hong Kong, then like people usually would say like Hong Kong has a history for about like 150 years. It could be longer than that, but that's like how the story is usually being told. So like before Hong Kong was handed back to the CCP, China in 1997, it was first belonged to the one of the last Asian Chinese empire. And when the empire collapsed, it was like still within the control of the British. Even after the Second World War, Hong Kong was not handed back to like, well, the CCP China by then, because like, well, the leaders of the CCP China, they felt that maybe we let the British run Hong Kong, then we could like use it in the long run. So that's one of the slogan in the mindset, one of the strategy that have in their mind. So let the British keep Hong Kong, and let's focus on our stuff on the mainland. And for sure, there's also a lot of like geopolitical implication and reasons for coming up with this kind of conclusion for them. So like speaking about the population of Hong Kong, like after the Second World War, there are like a lot of migrants coming to Hong Kong because of the fear of the CCP governance and also because of the Cultural Revolution in China. So you see like a rising population in Hong Kong. They flock to Hong Kong. So they bring in like laborers, technical knowledge, like capital. And what also happens after the Second World War was like the British order was collapsing. And there was like a huge process of decolonization. And in the 1970s, it was also a time the United States was trying to like rebuild its diplomatic relationship with China. So in the United Nations, the Chinese representative who was representing the Taiwanese government, governed by the Nationalist Party, which fought war against CCP but lost to it. like they were the representative in the UN. But when the United States wanted to build relationship with China, then the Taiwanese representative or the nationalist representative got kicked out. And the CCP representative got into the UN. They made a request. They said, we want to remove Hong Kong from the category of the colonial territories. So the proposal was passed. It has a significant implication on Hong Kong's future. Because once the bill was passed, it meant that Hong Kong, unlike other colonial territory, the people could not say, let's have a vote and decide our future. They have no right of self-determination. So that's why in the 80s and 90s, people do not have right to vote on their future. So that's the historical background. So it is like the historic decision made in 1970s were very crucial. And what happened next was the CCP government, they also wanted to take back Taiwan. But by then, in the late 1970s, the United States was saying, we are going to protect Taiwan and we are going to sell arms to Taiwan. So like the CCP Chinese government, it has like very slim chance for them to take back Taiwan. So they come up with an idea. Let's try the idea of one country, two system. Let's test it out in Hong Kong. And in the long run, maybe this system will work. And we could make an appeal to the Taiwanese. And we could like achieve our goal of national unification. So that's one of the goals, that's one of the idea in the mind of the CCP leaders. So here comes the one country, two system, the idea of one country, two system. And in the 80s, it was also a time the Chinese government, the CCP Chinese government, they was trying to reform China's economy. Like after a decade of Cultural Revolution, there was like a huge shift among the leadership. And the leaders of the Chinese government, they was also like struggling, like how could they maintain their governance? So they're thinking in economic terms. And one of the idea is to reform the market, to sell the market, and also to reform its economy. And in that particular juncture, Hong Kong has a role to really pass on information, technology, labors into China. And if you think about like the world economy in the 1970s and 80s, it was a time that like a lot of industries moved out from the United States. And where did they go? Most of them settled in East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. So a lot of the like consumer products like toys, electrical machines, like radio, refrigerator, they're like clothes, they're all produced in those East Asia countries. And Hong Kong was one of them. So when like, well, the Chinese leader thinking about how to set up his economy, the business people in Hong Kong, they actually were trying to relocate the industry to China, bring in capital, bring in information, bring in a lot of the tactics and the technical knowledge to produce goods and also foreign capital. So the idea behind one country, two system is that China, in the long run, it might still run as a socialist country or a communist country, but Hong Kong would maintain as a capitalist city. So it could provide the resources, as we know, to China to rebuild China's economy. So that's the plan. And that's why, like in 1984, the British and the Chinese government leaders, they signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. They set up a committee to draft the basic law. And in 1990, they actually settled down on the final version of the basic law. And in the process, when the Chinese government was trying to like persuade the Hong Kong people to really agree and be convinced about the plan, and here comes the consensus. They said, okay, Hong Kong is gonna be returned to China. So what reward would Hong Kong people be given? So one of the consensus made was that Hong Kong would have a gradual reform concerning the electoral system in the long run. So people will have democracy, they will have one person, one vote, they could elect a city leader, and the Chinese government won't intervene. So that consensus was written in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and also later the Basic Law. But what happened in 1989 is like you have the Tiananmen massacre in China. So people were terrified. A lot of people fly away. But a year after, like after the massacre in 1990s, like the consensus between the British government and the Chinese government, it was not intervened. It was being held as usual. So like the basic law was finalized. And in 1997, Hong Kong was handed back to China. And interestingly, if you look at the details of the basic law, there are a lot of the agreements and a lot of the articles that would rarely be written in this way. But in the basic law of Hong Kong, you can see a lot of the like capitalist characteristic instruction on how to run the city, concerning your budget, concerning the role of the city, concerning of the legal environment. They are being written in the Constitution, in the basic law. And if you see it, like as I show you in the PowerPoint, Article 107, 109, they are saying like the government should maintain a really good budget in like, well, keeping the expenditure within the limits of the revenues. And they should take a low tax policy. And the city of Hong Kong should also remain as an international financial city. And if you want to trace the origin, people would say it is because in the 1980s, when people were like, when the two countries were negotiating the nitty-gritties, like most of the members who draft the law, the constitution, they were from the business sector. But that was also the idea of one country, two systems. You need to maintain Hong Kong as a financial city so China could benefit. But if you think about like, well, what happened after national security law was introduced, could Hong Kong still maintain that role? Does it infringe the basic law? That would be a very interesting question. And on the political side, like the city leader would be elected by 1,200 people. The city leader will not be elected by like every citizen. And in the legislative council, you have like 70 seats. Only half of them would be elected democratically, one person, one vote. And another half of the seats, they will be elected by different small circle election. Say the finance sector, you will have 125 people electing one seat, and the insurance sector with another 130 members electing another seat. So that is how the game was being played out in Hong Kong. Surely you could imagine there would be like a lot of confrontation and conflict. And that's why in 2003, when the Hong Kong government said, we are going to introduce a national security law, it provoked huge protest. And the conflict did not stop in 2014, 6 years ago. People occupied the street because people were saying, we can no longer bear the situation. We need a reform immediately. Otherwise, you cannot resolve the political and economic conflict within Hong Kong and also between Hong Kong and the Beijing government. The Occupy was not successful on like substantial term to reform the electoral system. And that's why 2 years later, you have more clashes between the protesters and the police. And the protesters were saying, we need a more militant approach to confront with the police because we have no way out. Peaceful, nonviolent tactic doesn't work. And 3 years later, you have the anti-extradition movement that you saw last year when the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government was saying, let's reform the legal system in Hong Kong so we could extradite people that are wanted by the Chinese government to be extradited from Hong Kong to China. And if you want to understand the political part, then you also have to understand the economic development since the 1990s. So when one country, two systems was invented, it has a plan to really like make Hong Kong as a partner to bring in technology, capital, and labor, and the managerial skills to China, to set up companies, to bridge the local manufacturers to the foreign consumer market. But what happened since the 1990s was like Hong Kong was no longer an industrial city. Most of the factories moved to China. And Hong Kong actually struggled on the economic term. How could it survive on the economic level? And one way out was that like in the early 2000s, China has a booming market. And they said, let's bring in more people to China so Hong Kong could survive. So maybe we could reposition Hong Kong as a new city that is gonna based on tourism, service, and finance-based industry. And that would be a way out for Hong Kong. And in the process, the city is not governed well in a way that the wealth and resources were distributed in an equal way because of how the political system was structured. As you could imagine, like how the city leaders was elected and how the legislative council members are elected, and result in like a huge problematic economic policy that result in wealth gap and a lot of grievances. So when you have the political threat like national security law or the extradition law bill, like people have a lot of fear and angers towards the government. And the latest development is the national security law concerning secession, subversion, and in particular, the charges about collision with foreign or external forces to endanger national security. So that is like the latest development, and I'll end here, and we could go into the detail to dig out more of the details and also some of the themes.
Okay, thank you, Alex. That was a wonderful presentation. Before we continue, I just want to mention two things. One is a notice that we just had Anna Chung join us. She's with Hong Kong Democracy Council, HKDC, and she was very instrumental in facilitating this event. So thank you, Anna, and welcome. The second thing is we talked about the national security law, and if anyone is interested, maybe we'll have another discussion in the future. We could really analyze the nuts and bolts of what's in the law. I actually read it in anticipation of this event, and I could tell you I'm very well versed in con law. Half of this would be struck down as unconstitutional in the US because the hallmark of any law is you have to, it cannot be broad or vague. And this law, you don't even know what it is that they could penalize you for. And the severity, 5 to 10 years imprisonment, including, being subject to re-education camps and retraining camps. I mean, that's just rife with unconstitutionality. So if anyone's interested, we could certainly talk about, kind of go through and analyze the law. And, it's basically the draconian version of the USA Patriot Act, whereas the Patriot Act was focused on surveillance and information gathering. This is basically trying to rule the entire society by fear, because you don't know what's in the law. So you don't want to test the limits. And if you dare to say anything even critical, remotely unfavorable to the central government, well, guess what? You're going to be extradited. So it's very troublesome. Just one last point on Alex's presentation. The hallmark of the status of Hong Kong has always been having the independent judiciary. What that means is there's a lot of common law that Hong Kong judiciary maintained after '97. And, a lot of the benefits of the common law is that, yes, it's based on legal precedents, and there's some degree of predictability, reliability, and justice and fairness. And when that is torn apart by the implementation of this draconian national security law in the name of national security, then you're basically left with ruling by fear. So very troublesome, but I'm glad that, we talked about it, so we could certainly go into that more. So now we're going to go into the second part of the event, which is me as the moderator asking questions to our experts. So I want to throw the first question at Alex, which is just going back to the national security law. It was passed June 30th of this year. And as you know, everything that the central government does, it's not done by accident, or it wasn't inadvertent. So the timing is highly suspect, Alex. Can you talk about the importance of what June 30th is in the context of those in Hong Kong?
Sure, thank you for the question. So when people analyze the intention behind the national security law, people will usually say like the Chinese government is trying to capitalize on the pandemic to maintain its control, because like it is also realizing there will be like a huge economic transformation on the planetary scale. And they also realized the clash between China and the United States. And in order to maintain its control, why not extend its control over Hong Kong during this time? If we pass the law, then the people in Hong Kong actually could hardly resist. And perhaps this is the right timing So that is like one of the strong like reason, or like one of the most convincing reason in explaining what happened and why the national security law came out.
Okay, but the timing is interesting because isn't July 1st the anniversary of when the transfer took place?
Yes, like July 1st is also like a symbolic moment. It is usually like celebrated as like the anniversary of like, well, the date Hong Kong was like handed back to China. Like people have a lot of interpretation about like, well, why it was passed in July 1st. And people felt like, well, one of the symbolic gestures is that like, well, the way Hong Kong would be governed, it will no longer be the same. Like people were saying, you have the basic law, but like after like July 1st, you also have a newly built-in law built into basic law, which overrides a lot of the nitty-gritties speculated in the basic law. So that is the symbolic dimension.
Okay, and in 2019, before the pandemic, basically shut down the entire world, there were protests very actively in Hong Kong. And I believe that was in response to the extradition bill. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So are you asking about the extradition bill? Sorry, the extradition movement?
Yes.
So as you, probably your memory is still fresh, there was like a half a year long anti-extradition movement started since June 2019. And the background of the anti-extradition movement was because the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government planned to amend the legal system in Hong Kong. So they were saying, we really need to amend the law so we can extradite people that are wanted and persecuted by the Chinese government back from Hong Kong to China. So, so it triggers the whole procedure of reforming the legal system. And when people really reflect on the incident, there was like a tiny legal incident triggering the whole wave of protests. What happened was there was like a murder case in Hong Kong, like a Hong Konger murdered her girlfriend in Taiwan, and then the person then flew back to Hong Kong. And between Hong Kong and Taiwan, there was no extradition arrangement to really extradite the person from Hong Kong to Taiwan. Of course, you could do that on a case-by-case basis. But the Hong Kong government said that in order to build a more comprehensive and well-rounded, solid legal system, then perhaps we should review the legal system and make a more comprehensive reform. And hence, you have the extradition bill to reform the system. And that triggers people's anxiety and fear, because people felt like, what is the real purpose behind the bill? Is it only because of this particular case? Or is the government trying to extradite activists or a media tycoon like Jimmy Lai, who was being arrested recently, back to China in the long run? And there's also a lot of like, well, speculation by then arguing or saying that the Chinese government was thinking about a lot of the business people who are from mainland China, but they stay in Hong Kong. And as you might know, like, well, political infight is a huge issue in China. So they really want to like, well, catch those like business people who are staying in Hong Kong and extradite them back to China. So that might be probably another drive of like having the extradition legal reform in Hong Kong. So there are like many incentives and reasons converging in that particular bill, hence also triggering the protests of Hong Kong people last year. So that is like the short version of the bill and also the movement.
Okay, and in your bio, there's a reference to you had some kind of a run-in with the law in 2017. To the extent you're okay talking about it, can you tell us what were the circumstances that resulted in you having to be subject to certain penal ramifications?
Speaking about my case, one of the symbolic meaning of my case is that we were imprisoned when the government appealed its judgment to the court. In the first trial, we were penalized in a way that we only have to commit community service back in 2016. But the government disagreed with the legal judgment, the legal ruling. So they made an appeal. And in 2017, the court actually made a new ruling saying that we actually have to penalize the activists to stop activism being spread across Hong Kong. So if you try to analyze the change behind a legal ruling, people would say the judges and also the atmosphere and the legal environment in Hong Kong is gradually more and more inclined to a more authoritarian approach to really use laws to punish activists and to stop activism. So like that is the symbolic meaning of like, well, how like people like participating in movement being sentenced for community service in first, then being imprisoned when they faced an appeal by the government.
Okay, and going back to 2014, I believe there was an infamous white paper that was published or released by Beijing. Can you talk about the significance of that for those in Hong Kong?
The 2014 white paper was a symbolic document that like the Beijing government saying that this would be the new instruction for how Hong Kong should be ruled and how Hong Kong should be governed. One article stipulate that even legal practitioners, they should learn to serve for the interests of the government. And that is very symbolic in the way that one, the Chinese government rarely like issue a document like this because before 2014, there's a consensus in Hong Kong and perhaps Beijing to some degree that the Chinese government should not interfere Hong Kong's affair, although we witnessed like a gradual increasing of intervention across time. But when in 2014, when people see the white paper being issued, saying that like this is how the way like Hong Kong should be governed, it is like a wake-up call. People were like, well, aware that there are more and more intervention coming into Hong Kong. So that is the symbolic meaning that like how you could make sense of it.
Okay, I'm going to turn over to Suzanne. Now, Suzanne, I know you've done some reporting on the ground in 2014 during the umbrella protest. What were your observations then, and how is that different than the recent movement?
Oh, well, partly it was the issue, in that the issue was less of a threat, an immediate threat to people's safety, and more of an aspiration. They wanted free elections, and they felt like this was a system that needed reform, Alex mentioned, because the economics of the city are so brutally unfair. And that has ramifications for every component of society. It's very hard to get into, you can get labeled very early on and go to a substandard government school where you get less exposure to English. And if you don't have a parent who is, I'm taking a little far afield, but I'm going to go back. If you don't have a parent who's actually being proactive and saying, okay, I'm going to enroll my child in a tutorial, I'm going to give my child, have them go to an after-school program so she can get exposure to English. That then limits you as you move, as you grow up, and it limits the kind of schools you can enter. And so what I saw, there was obviously on the ground, there was for the whole framework of the protest, it was over different issues. One of them was an aspirational issue, and last year was much more of a danger, of a physical danger. If they can come for a tax cheat, they can come for a Catholic minister, a Catholic priest. They could come for a businessman. They can extradite anyone. and there's no way to appeal or argue against the Chinese legal system. So it was a much more of a pressing need. But they also felt, and I was saying this to Tom yesterday, Alex and I had two very different experiences in 2014. Mine was much more as a newcomer, very naive to Hong Kong's history and politics. And it was intoxicating. I've been a reporter for almost 40 years, and I've never been in an environment where there were tens of thousands of people talking about politics knowledgeably, and talking about ways their system were deficient and simple ways to fix their system. And I'm talking teenagers were talking about this. I felt that Hong Kong young people were really well educated about their history and their system, and explaining this to foreigners. And they were really, that's always characterized the Hong Kong protests, is they want that international attention. So they take it upon themselves to, if they speak English, they speak to the foreigners, they translate for the foreigners. There were a few other differences from last year. So one was the fact, what was the issue? One was the nature of the protest was largely much more peaceful in 2014. There were some confrontations with police. Confrontation became the underlying drive in 2019. There was, this was partly because the protesters knew that the more confrontations they had with police, they would get more attention internationally from the media, or get more attention from the media, and therefore drive international concern. And it worked. But there also was massively more violence from the police, starting from the first mass protest the second, on June 12th, 2019, that there had been a peaceful crowd. They had, there had been, yes, some people who had thrown things at the police, but that was a fraction, an infinitesimal fraction compared to the tens of thousands of people who were out there outside of the LegCo. The goal was, we're going to stop the lawmakers from entering the building. And so we're surrounding the building, we're getting on the highway, and we're going to keep the cars from coming in. They're not going to be able to vote on this extradition bill. And the response was hours and hours of fire from the police, including not just tear gas, rubber bullets, bean bags, which I didn't know what they were. They're like pellets inside of these nylon bags, and brutal beatings of people. And some of this is like, I'm not talking about frontliners who are confronting them. I'm talking about a 40-something-year-old social worker who is well known in the community. And I have to think that someone in the police knew her. And there were white-shirted police, photographed, video, beating the hell out of this woman curled on the ground. And so that really turned the protest. And then every week, there were these incidents like that. There were just massive violence from the police. So yes, people will say, but, there's a lot of whataboutism in this protest. Yes, the protesters responded with fire and Molotov cocktails, and they trashed offices and they broke windows and they were very violent. But that was not going on when 1 million people came into the street on, what was it, Alex? June, forgetting my dates. 6 was the first mass protest.
9th or 12th?
9th. Thank you. June 9th, first mass, an estimated 1 million people. And it was just a sea of protesters wearing white shirts, and the police were restrained that day. And then it was like they had all had lobotomies 3 days later. The change was profound. And I've been at a lot of mass protests, only in Hong Kong. I haven't been to something like that except one in New York. I have nothing to compare it to. I've never seen police behave that way. And except in 2014, there were a few nights that were bad. But so it was a level of danger, and the issue was more fraught. Obviously, since 2014, there have been many, many years where rights have been degraded. So people were already on edge. I have gone back and forth between America and Hong Kong. I haven't lived there continuously, mostly because of family reasons. So when I go back, I'm always struck by the palpable change in the environment. And 2019 just felt much more tense and angry. And I don't mean angry like they were gunning for a fight. I mean angry at the government. Just fury at what was happening.
Is it safe to say that there is a generational divide? So perhaps like an older person might be more sympathetic to Beijing as opposed to younger person might be not as sympathetic?
No, not. I saw a little of that in 2014. There were generational divides, but then you see like really old people out there, like, my age. I saw some of that, but no, there was no, I didn't see a massive age difference. I didn't see an education difference. I noticed that a lot of the people who were at the most front of the front line are from blue collar families. And you could definitely see that. I remember after one very, very bad night, there were mass arrests. There were 95 people charged with riot. And I went to court the next day, and I pulled the one document you can get from the clerk is basically the charge sheet, and you can see the addresses. I really wanted to see where these people were from. And they're largely from the housing projects and the more blue collar, if you would, grassroots as they call them in Hong Kong, neighborhoods. Not all, not exclusive. There was some really interesting differences. There was a kid who was Indian Hong Kong, and a lot of the Indians are Parsi and they're upper class. And so I remember he was 12. But the thing that also struck me about that day was the injuries. I've never been in a courtroom like that. Almost every defendant had a bandage on. And this wasn't like a bandage for show. These are people who had been treated by hospital personnel, and they had bandages on their heads. One of them had a broken arm. They had injuries on their neck. I'd never seen a more banged up group of defendants in my life. So I do think that there's, in some ways, there's an older generation that has a closer tie. They feel a closer bond to China, but then like the Jimmy Lai's of the world blow that apart. Jimmy Lai is not an independence advocate. He would like to see China reform. He's not asking for a separation, but he's also asking for democracy. And I think there are a lot of people like that, people in their 60s and 70s who see China's authoritarian control doesn't work long term. It is harming its people, and they're going to harm the Hong Kong people.
So speaking of Jimmy Lai, his arrest took place earlier this week. And what would you say is the significance, other than obviously he's a very well-known person, especially in the Western world, because he's an outspoken critic. And the extent that we know in the West about Jimmy Lai is he's like this kind of self-made, successful person in media. But do you think there's something bigger to this arrest other than just, a crackdown on someone who's famous?
I think there's a couple components. Jimmy's arrest followed a few other arrests or coincided with a few other arrests. One of them is somebody Alex knows well, Agnes Chow. Agnes has been Agnes was a child protester. She's been an activist since she was a teenager, and she was part of this movement that wanted to stop so-called patriotic education, a program that was designed to foster feelings of patriotism in school children toward the PRC. And she was picked up in the same batch of people as Jimmy. It was kind of bizarre. There was, you know, picking up the editors and the chief executive of Next and Jimmy and searching the newsroom. And then there was Agnes. And Agnes, as far as I know, is not connected with Apple Daily. Also, there was another young man who had been an activist with Agnes as a young man, and he's a journalist, but not for Apple Daily, and he was picked up. But in the weeks prior, there was a young man, again, another young activist advocating for independence. I think he started when he was about 15, and now he's a few years older than that. And then there's these threats of warrants for these people who fled Hong Kong. And so to me, it's all these people got let out on bail, which actually really surprised me about Jimmy. And to me, that sent a message. And I want Alex to push back if he thinks my interpretation is off. But I think the government is not quite ready. They don't really have the apparatus in place to start acting on the components of the national security law. So they really want to scare the hell out of everyone. Shut the hell up. We've warned you. We warned you before. We told you these were acts of terrorism. We told you you're trying to separate from the Chinese nation. We will take action against you. Okay, now there's a law. Shut up. Just shut up. Stop working with people overseas. Stop raising money. And now they've arrested a very big, they're holding out on Joshua Wong because the international world will go bananas if they arrest him. I don't know what this is an Alex question. I don't really have a sense of what's going to happen if they arrest Joshua, but these are all warnings to the rest of us. Keep your mouth shut. Just like the comparison, it's a very poor comparison. There's a big difference between getting threatened with national security and having your visa blocked. But I raise this issue. Everyone in the foreign media world went bananas when Hong Kong blocked, as they put it, a visa for a Financial Times journalist named Victor Mallet. And this, Alex, when did it happen? 2018? 16? Can't remember.
It was 16.
It was 16? So Victor had hosted a young man who was an advocate for independence at the Foreign Correspondents Club. And he was threatened, the FCC was threatened. You can't have somebody who's a separatist as a guest. And so Victor was the host, and Victor was a well-known journalist there. And then lo and behold, Victor's visa is blocked. Well, Victor was already on his way out. He had already given notice. He was leaving. He was going to Paris, relocating for the paper. And what he did was his visa was ending, and he tried to enter short-term on a visitor visa to Hong Kong to wrap up his affairs. And then he was blocked. So it was a message more than it was an action. And I do feel like perhaps that's what we're seeing now. They're not acting. They're not keeping these people in prison. They're sending messages to the general society. Keep your mouth shut. We're done here. No more protests. No more, I got to try out my Cantonese. Guang Fong Hong Kong, si doi got me. How was that, Alex? Bad? He's like, what did she say? No more chanting. No more going to malls and shouting and singing national or your version of a national anthem. Done. Right? And people are frightened. And so they're complying. And that's what the government wants.
Alex, do you want to add anything to that? either the arrest of Jimmy Lai or just the crackdown in media in general, or suppression of free speech for that matter?
No, I don't have anything to add right now.
Okay.
I've taken the words out of his mouth. The very first time that's happened.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next segment, which is the Q&A from the audience. But before we get to that, I just want to follow up on a point that Suzanne has made regarding, the role of media and the new national security law. Article 10 imposes an affirmative duty by the media. And I'm just going to read you an excerpt from Article 10 and see what you think if that kind of, framework was required in the US. It says, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, SAR, shall promote national security education in schools, universities, and through social organizations such as the media and the internet and other means to raise awareness of the Hong Kong residents of national security and the obligations to abide by the law. Again, that sentence right there, the obligations to abide by the law. So what that's doing, if I'm interpreting this correctly, and presuming nothing is lost in translation, is they're putting the onus now on the media saying, this is the government propaganda. You citizens must abide by this law. If not, there will be severe consequences. And we know what those are, right? 5 to 10 years in labor camps, re-education camps, or imprisonment. So they're placing the onus on the media. Could you imagine if the federal government told that in the US to all the media outlets saying, you gotta promote the USA Patriot Act so that the citizens will follow the obligation to abide by the law? That would be a classic First Amendment violation. I mean, that would get struck down so quickly that, there's no debate over whether if it's, constitutional. So again, that's kind of the regime that we're dealing with right now. With that in mind, let's go ahead and open this up to the audience. Just 2 requirements. We're just going to ask you to use the hand raising function, and we'll kind of go in order. And if you do want to ask a question, if you could just temporarily put your video on just for the question so that we know who it's coming from. And then you could shut your video off if you choose to do it. So, and then, please make sure the question ends in a question mark rather than making a statement. Yes, I know we're talking about a very controversial topic, and I'm sure all of you have something to add to it, but we do want to, keep it focused. So any questions? Let's see. I don't see any hands up. Well, there's one question, I guess, in the chat room, and maybe we'll get to this one first, and then maybe others might want to chime in. There's a question about whether, China's grand ambitions about, Made in China 2025, how that kind of fits in with the overall crackdown, if any. Does anyone know if there's any connection with that?
Oh boy, this is not my bailiwick. Alex, can you?
I could try to address that question, but it is also a very tricky question. But I think the economic dimension surely has a very crucial component in driving China's new policy domestically and also diplomatically. If you try to put things in perspective and think about China's economic development, then you could see that Hong Kong being handed back to China is a very crucial moment for the Chinese government to really get a boost in its economy. And when people usually talk about China's economy, they would say China's economic reform started in the late 1970s, and because of the capital from Hong Kong and Taiwan went into China, and that's how China got to bring in the technology to build up its local businesses, to be happening to manufacture products that could export them to the American consumer market. So that is a very critical moment for China to rebuild its economy. But when people talk about economy, it is usually the low-end products. But starting from 2000, people try to pay more attention to then how China would upgrade its industrial policy, like the Western countries or like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. How would China build up its IT industry, its high-tech industry, to really push forward its economy? So China, it would have huge consumer market itself, it will also has the capacity to manufacture products on the low-end products as well as the high-end products. So when it comes to the previous decade, like after 2010, this kind of event becomes like more pressing, because after 2008 financial crisis, people were saying like the Western countries, say Europe or the United States, they're actually losing the capacity to consume products. They also like losing the battle, losing the race to compete with China in producing IT industry in the long run. That might be a reality. And it is also a time China was testing out a new economic policy to really like allocate a lot of monies into local domestic market and manufacturing products. And that's when like the idea of like made in China 2025 came out. And hence you have the idea of one belt, one road, how China was like reimagining the Asian world order, like how it could like extend its control and its friendship along countries surrounding China, so as to like rebuild the world order. And when President Trump came to stage, then you have like a new development. You have the trade war, and you have the clash concerning the technology sector. And because of the pandemic, it also makes the things more unpredictable, because whether China could still sustain its economy, that's a big question. Would the products still be exported to other countries? That's one question. And how could the domestic business survive? That's another question. And the question would be whether the Chinese consumer market could really absorb all the demand and the supply. And that's the third question. And here comes the political decision. How can the CCP maintain its control over China and Hong Kong? And if you think in this way and try to follow this route, then how the Chinese government is trying to reposition its policy, its approach towards Hong Kong, it also has a symbolic meaning. Because in the past, they would say like, well, for the Chinese government, Hong Kong has a very crucial component in bringing in technology and serving as a financial hub for China to rebuild its economy, for it to incorporate, to blend into the world economy, to blend in to the capitalist world economy. But right now, it seems that like China would say like they no longer need Hong Kong on the economic terms, and whether Hong Kong will still maintain as a crucial financial hub to China, it is hard to say. It seems like it could be true, it could be wrong. It depends on what happened during the pandemic and after the pandemic. And if you think in those terms, then like the relationship between China and the world, then that would be a really determining factor in impacting China-Hong Kong relation, and also like well how China's policy domestically and economically like what would be heading to. So that would be like some ideas that like folks might want to keep in mind to try to analyze like the relationship and the dynamic between China and the world and Hong Kong.
Okay, so it sounds like it kind of fits nicely into their grand vision of some kind of a realignment and some kind of, for lack of a better word, world order. And, this is just kind of a, a starting ground, if you will, or, a dry run, so to speak. Okay. I see a hand up from Matthew. Matthew, go ahead. It's your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne and Alex. I guess what I was wondering is, we all know that in the past several weeks and really the past several months, there's been a chilling effect over protesters and activists. But I was wondering, I guess this might be directed a little bit more directly towards Alex. What has this done on the ground towards in terms of the morale of some of the core activists? Do they see a hope of anything beyond a continual gradual decline into China's grasp? Has this done much to stunt their underlying fervor, given that just continual large public demonstrations are probably not in the immediate future?
Thanks, Matthew. I would try to make sense of what the activists were thinking or are thinking recently. Surely, as you can imagine, there's also a split among activists that it could hardly like be united, but at least people could like reach some consensus. So some of the arguments made by the activists in Hong Kong would say this is also a critical moment. This is like a new development, like how one country, two system is perceived, imagined, operated, and envisioned. It is completely different from the past. So it is like a new stage, it is a new world. So people are rewriting the games and the rules. When people are situating at this critical juncture, since last year, people were saying we should also like, well, this is a situation facing us. And perhaps we should also learn from the past lessons, like the 2014 umbrella movement. So that movement also like attracts a lot of people's attention. But for the local activists, they rarely think about how to collaborate with like, well, people outside Hong Kong. But last year in the anti-extradition movement, you see a lot of the activists across spectrums, they were saying we need to like, well, speak to the international community, because like by Hong Kong activists alone, you could hardly like, well, push it back. Like, well, the local protest is very crucial. That is where the momentum comes from. But they also need allies across the world. And that's why you see a lot of translation. People will take a lot of like media interview. They will like, well, travel to different places to do advocacy work. And here comes the tricky part. They would say like, well, okay, so the local protest is crucial, but we also need the international world to pressure China, to pressure Chinese government. And that's why the international community sanctioning the Chinese government is very crucial, because they would say like how Hong Kong protests could really apply pressure to the Chinese government. You could not get rid of the economic dimension, because simply by talking like democracy, human rights, they are crucial components, but they do not really harm the Chinese government in a way that they might back down. So thinking about like on economic terms, that is crucial. And when the United States and the Chinese government were having like so-called trade negotiation, so people try to like, well, push this kind of argument forward, saying then like the international community should sanction China. If the local protests work, and if the international community sanctions China on economic terms, then that might create more pressure among the leadership of the Chinese government. And if it could open up some cracks, say like President Xi might face more infight with his allies, then that might open up more spaces. So that is one of the very convincing arguments to a lot of the local activists. And that's why you would see like, well, why in many of the like, well, media shot, when you see protests in Hong Kong, some people, only a minority of them despite, they would like, well, try to wave the American flag. They would say like, hey, we're here. We need the support from the United States. We need the support from the Americans. So they like people who are waving the flags, they are not the majority. Like maybe you could like only a dozen of people would do that. But what they are trying to do, it is an aspiration. You can see like, well, how they are trying to strategize or think about the movement in the long run. And they would say like, well, without a collective effort to pressure the government, the Chinese government in this way, it could hardly change the destiny and the future of Hong Kong, because that would be the crucial leverage point. So then, like that is like, well, how the people like in Hong Kong, especially the activists, like, well, not only the core activists, but like activists in general, we're thinking about. But surely, one last point is, after the national security law, people will have more concern about like, well, how to think about those things strategically. Because if you like publicly like advocate this kind of idea, asking the government, international, like, well, foreign government to sanction China, you might get caught, that you will be arrested, like Jimmy Lai, and say like another young activist, Nathan Law, he had to flee the city in order to attain a hearing section of the U.S. Congress. So like that is the conundrum facing like the activists in Hong Kong.
And on the point of waving a flag, the U.S. flag, that would violate Article 20 of the National Security Law. It says, any act that would be viewed as committing secession or undermining national unification will be a guilty offense. And to me, nothing undermines a national unity than waving a flag of a hostile nation or a nation that's considered to be of hostile interest, i.e. the US. So, I think the law speaks for itself, and I'm sure, with the advent of this law being implemented, I'm sure a lot of protesters will certainly, it'll have a chilling effect in terms of the exercise of that symbolic speech. Okay, we have another question from, let's see, Tony. Tony, it's your turn. Go ahead.
I want to add something to something you just said, may I? I think maybe it won't chill, but it's just going to force it more of it online. And it already was a movement that had flowered fully, and not just on social media, but again, the international component of this is so powerful. And I'm glad Alex, you can all see why Alex is such an important figure in this movement, because he's able to coalesce the history and the current trends, and to predict where the movement is going. But I think much more of it's going to be done overseas, and through building bridges with other movements. But more on that. Thanks.
Great presentation, guys. So my question is there any concern on the part of Beijing that, these protests and everything, the US or some other nation, they might try characterizing this as something like, a human rights abuse or something, and they might try invoking something like a duty to protect provision and try intervening militarily or something like that? And, is there any talk about, amongst countries of actually considering that possibility? Thanks.
Alex?
Let me see if I get the question rightly. Like Tony, are you speaking to the potential sanction by the international, by the government in the West? I'm just trying to clarify the question, so I might be able to address it.
Yes, I mean sanctions, or even even military intervention, perhaps, or something.
Okay, thank you. I'm not so sure about military intervention. If you ask politicians from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party whether they want to wage war with China, I think that is a big question mark. But I think folks have a consensus that things should be changed. But how should things be changed? That is a huge question that is unanswerable by other side of the party. There's a new analysis developing in the States saying that try to take a hawker approach towards China on the diplomatic level. That seems to be the new consensus. So no matter who is going to be the new president of the United States, that might be the diplomatic consensus towards China. So hardliners will dominate the diplomatic policies towards China. So there may be more and more discussion and talking point about human rights abuses, about unfair economic or labor practices, about how to maintain one country, two system. So you might be able to see more and more statements issued by the countries in Europe or in the States. But here comes the question about the approach they take. The question is, it seems politicians could take this line as how they speak about China's issue or Hong Kong China issue, or even the Xinjiang concentration camp, or how people are treated in Tibet, or Taiwan China relation. But the question, if people try to think about the economic terms, then it is not just about China. It is also about the United States. So if you think about China is the country who manufacture cheap products for a consumer market in the States and elsewhere, then how the US economy is going to sustain itself if they no longer have cheap products provided by China? Perhaps manufacturers might move to other places, but the real question is how like, well, the people in the United States could have a better living, so they could really develop a long-term, like, well, peaceful and healthy economic relationship and diplomatic relationship with China. That is the real question. And that's the question that, like, well, people rarely talk about, but that is a crucial point for, like, for people to keep in mind, because if we don't, like, well, take that dimension into consideration, we could foresee that there will be like an escalated confrontation between the United States and China. Probably military confrontation or clashes might happen in the South China Sea, but it might not like end up into like a full-scale war between the two countries. That might be less a scenario, but like some regional confrontation that might happen. But does that help for like the two countries and also the world in the long run on the economic and diplomatic terms? That is a question. But like, well, going back to your point about like, well, some of the criticism made by the government, we foresee that there may be like, well, more and more criticism and statements issued by like officials, politicians, and NGOs across the world.
Yeah, and if I could just comment on that, I think Tony's question is, will there be any kind of military showdown? I think the answer is probably not, because there has not been a direct one-on-one military showdown. I mean, we've had proxy wars during the Cold War between the two great superpowers, but I think where you're going to see a lot of confrontation will be through, you know, the other territories, whether it's the South China Sea, or there could be some kind of like a cyber warfare, or there could be some sort of like a diplomatic tit for tat. And what I mean by that is we saw the consulate's office, both here in the US and in Chengdu, shut down. And to me, once you have that shut down, and that's almost unprecedented, especially the one in Houston, because that was the first, you know, location that China was able to open up the consulate's office in attempt to normalize relations. I think that's going to really, you know, pave the way for what could be otherwise described as, you know, a point of no return. Okay, let's see. I see a question that's posted from in the chat room. RP, I don't know if you want to ask your questions directly, or I could read it to either Suzanne or Alex. RP, are you there? You want to direct your question, or? Okay, if not, I'll just read it. It's basically, you know, what do, are there bitter feelings or resentment between the protesters in Hong Kong and those on the mainland? And he or she, RP, wants to know if, you know, any of the protest efforts might alienate those on the mainland. And I guess what the question is getting at is, at some point, the protesters have to kind of, you know, win the proverbial hearts and minds, right? Because that's how you kind of, you know, garner further support instead of being more, I guess, desperate, which is a term that Suzanne had used to describe the movement. So any comments on that question?
I'm kicking that to Alex.
Definitely there's like a bitter feeling between like the Hong Kong protesters and some of the PRC mainland residents. Let me see let me see, like, well, let me try to put it this way. There's like conflict between, like, well, some of the Hong Kong residents and some of the PRC residents. So like, without doubt, that is like a new development between the Hong Kong protesters and the Chinese residents. And in the short term, I do not see any concrete solution to address that issues, because it is a very complex issue that it is hard to rationalize. And you could hardly, like, well, come up with like a consensus among protesters. So it mainly happen, like the conflict mainly happen like between like interpersonal level, and also it happens on the narrative level, on like, well, how Hong Kong people might try to narrate like the Chinese residents, and how the Chinese residents are taking the information from, like, well, perhaps like the state-owned media outlet from China, and trying to like, well, depict Hong Kong's movement as a movement that is like sponsored by foreign forces. So there's like a huge gap of understanding between like people who are receiving information from different media outlets. So it is a thing that could hardly be resolved. But some people are saying perhaps the hope rests on how to bridge the people who are like both progressive minded in both sides. So like you surely there will be a huge amount of people living in China who would be like supporting the movement or have sympathy over the movement. But the question is that because of the internet, the social media, and the media, they're all dominated by the government. You could hardly see alternative voices. If you voice alternative voices or opinion, then you might disappear overnight. So that is the risk that many Chinese residents are taking if they have to support the Hong Kong's movement publicly. And it turns out to also make the Hong Kong movement, to make it, to push it in a very difficult position. Like how could you publicly make alliance with the protesters or residents in China? So that is a tricky point that people are still navigating, but it is a difficult situation.
Another way to ask the question is, we've seen the rise of nationalism all throughout the world in the last decade, and China is certainly no exception. I read an article where I believe two students who are pro-democracy in Hong Kong, they gave like a talk at Columbia Law School, and then at the conclusion of that talk, you had a whole group of students from, I guess, the Chinese student organization. They just got up and started singing their national anthem as if it's like, their Olympic celebration. And I'm just wondering, yes, nationalism is rampant everywhere, but is there something very unique about what's going on on the mainland that's different than elsewhere? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's one thing that we could say. One very unique point or development about Chinese nationalism, you might have to link it back to the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. So when the CCP, when the Chinese Communist Party, when it talked about, it rarely talked about nationalism before 1989. When you pay attention to the discourse and the narrative and the propaganda made in mainland China before 1989, it is mainly about communism and capitalism. It usually positions communism as the winner and capitalism as the loser. But after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese leader started to realize communism, the way how they position communism, is running out of steam. It could no longer secure legitimacy for them. So they kind of shift their paradigm to start to use the nationalistic discourse, trying to bring nationalism into their propaganda. And they start to retell the story. They start to craft stories like a century of humiliation. They start a nationwide propaganda. They create parks in China. They create a lot of the educational curriculum. So even in Hong Kong, the schools, students from secondary school, high school, primary school, they would be invited to China to attend, to visit those nationalistic parks, to raise their awareness of nationalism. So that is the very tricky development of Chinese nationalism in China. So that is the point that might set apart its nationalism with other nationalism, if you take into account its historical development on its origin and how the government is trying to use it intentionally to rebuild its legitimacy.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I see a question. Let's see, from Ali. Go ahead, Ali. It's your turn.
Yeah, this question is probably for Alex. Have you seen a significant drop in foreign investment after the United States imposed this recent round of sanctions? I think it was only last month that the Congress and the President signed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And last week, in fact, they imposed the first round of enforcement that included sanctioning Carrie Lam. So I'm wondering whether, first, there's been a drop in foreign investment. Have you noticed it? And second, is this going to create more tension between the government and the protesters in terms of you're either with us or you're against us? If you have foreign support, if these people are sanctioning us, that means you're with them. If you're not with us. So how does that all play out in terms of foreign investment in general? And, you know, whether it's helping more or hurting more the cause of the protesters?
That is a very important question, and I'm afraid I might not be able to speak to that directly because it is a very new development and people are still like observing and collecting information concerning the potential possible trajectory of like how the economy would develop itself, like after like the latest sanction. But some of the guessing and some of the information that you might be able to see from the news is that like some of the manufacturers in China, say the manufacturers who's from Taiwan, which like help produce thousands and millions of iPhones, they are trying to reconsider, like to relocate its factories from China to India. So that is like one new development. So like this kind of symbolic move, it might catalyze a new, like it might even serve as a new indicator for investors to rethink whether they could like stay in China and still be profitable. The tariff, that would be one crucial component, but surely it also depends on the industry, what industry we are talking about. So it would be a very broad like question that I would say like I do not have a concrete idea and a short answer for that. But I would agree with you that it is a very crucial factors that we have to take into consideration. And I would also want to know the answer, to be honest. I would also want to know the answer because that might impact how the economic activities is going to be conducted in China and how China is going to survive the pandemic. And the pandemic surely would have a crucial impact on how would surely have an impact on the decision of the investors of Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, and also other Westerners. And one latest development, I'm not sure if you're aware, Google, I think 2 days ago, they said that they would decline, like the Google in Hong Kong, they said that they would decline any request made by the Hong Kong police. If they made a request to submit information of protesters, Google would decline it. And also like Google would place this new business center in Taiwan instead of Hong Kong. So you see a lot of new move between different people. And some of the professionals in Hong Kong say like, there's a lawyer that I talked to yesterday. She is in her early 30s. And she was also saying like, well, she is considering to move away from Hong Kong because they just got married and they don't feel like Hong Kong is a safe place to start a family. So there are like a lot of people, they are making decision whether they want to stay or they want to leave. And if they're gonna leave, it might take a couple of months for them to like, well, relocate all the things, the factories, the people, and all the logistic issues to elsewhere. But the pandemic will also like, well, like hinder this kind of development because like it impacts like people all over the world. So that would be a really challenging question and also a very crucial question.
Just a comment, just to kind of explain the complex, high stakes, three-dimensional nature of this conflict. You know, I think both leaders, Trump and Xi, they're trying to see who's going to blink first. Part of it is a lot of gamesmanship. They're trying to see whose bluff is more credible. Now, keep in mind, you know, we have an election year this year, 2020, obviously. And then also, although Xi is president for life, they need to recertify that status in year 2022, which is, you know, only 2 years away. So on one hand, you know, on the U.S. side, a lot of this is for domestic consumption because, you know, the proverbial, you know, being tough on China has been, you know, invoked. You go back to Mitt Romney and John McCain. They've always said that. And on the China side, you know, there's another reason, component to the national security law, which is to provide some kind of stability and certainty to the big businesses in Hong Kong. One of the big businesses is HSBC. I know it's a British bank, but they have a huge presence in Hong Kong, and they were one of the biggest champions of this, this law. Why? Because they want some certainty and predictability, and that's what businesses want. So, there's a lot of, kind of bluffing, tough talking back and forth, but I think ultimately some of this is for domestic consumption. So we have to kind of keep that in mind too. But I do want to ask a question to Alex, or maybe perhaps Suzanne too. Do you know how the pandemic has affected Hong Kong? Obviously, I think they're pretty successful in the early stage, but did they also suffer a massive economic downturn as a result?
To my knowledge, yes. Like a lot of the small businesses also suffer from the economic downturn, and like a huge proportion of them, they are they're basically like, well, the service and finance industry. And you can imagine without like tourists from China and also elsewhere, they suffer a lot. And also the business people who run factories in China and Southeast Asia, they also face like challenges about how to sustain their production. So they could complete their businesses, at least for the coming season. So this has been an ongoing issue.
So there was if I may, thank you. There was already some tension and blame of the protesters for slowing businesses. The number of air travelers and the travelers coming over the border, tourists, visits, not massively, but it's decreased in certain months last year. So that was already dropping because what mainland Chinese wants to come to the city and shop in an area where every night, like some of the areas in Mongkok and TST and Kowloon, were filled with people in the streets and tear gas canisters going off. And that freaked, and the concern that we were going to get attacked if we were mainland Chinese. That has, a few incidents have been really played up in state media that the Hong Kong people are attacking mainland Chinese. So that was a turnoff. But the virus is, they have, the Hong Kong government partially closed its borders. And I mean partially in that you cannot visit since second or third week in March and get a visa on demand. The number of flights coming in and the number of people on those flights massively down. So that has had this entire ripple effect on the tourism industry, certain other industries that were, I mean, there's no conventions. There are no mass tours. There are no really suppressed number of students coming in. And that means because most of the universities are saying that they're not going to be having classes open. That has kept people away. So that has a major ripple effect. People aren't renting places. They're not going to buy groceries. They are not taking part in the services. I think there's, I mean, I haven't been there myself because I haven't been able to go back. But the small businesses have had a terrible time through this. And there was a really good Business Week story a few weeks ago about how the yellow economy, as they call it, which is the businesses that have shown a support of the protest, have had a special attention, people coming and eating there or shopping there, and that has kept them alive because their regular traffic has depressed so much. And then you think of just like in America, nobody is buying clothes for offices because most people are working at home. And all the support network around a central business district is just not thriving. So yes, the economy has been hurt by this. I wanted, could I go back to something that was asked just the previous question about foreign nationals? I think there is, again, another Business Week story. They've done some really interesting stories lately. There was a concerted effort by the government to get government institutions, agencies, politicians, and businesses on board with the national security law, a big propaganda PR push. And so you started to see, my inbox was filling with all these press releases that we support the national security law. And the interesting thing was all the government agencies, the script was the same, the exact same wording. That is the same with the big banks and the big financial outfits. They have been pressured and they want to do business in mainland China. This is exactly the problem with the monopolization of that economy. People want to be able, you cannot operate just in Hong Kong. You need mainland China to survive. And that's true with workers. I've known many people, they're very active in the 2014 movement. And then their company was taken over, or their company hierarchy shifted. And all of a sudden, there was an expectation that everybody would go over the border for business meetings. And I had a friend who freaked, absolutely freaked. He didn't want to travel to mainland China. So what did that do? That changed his politics. That suppressed, he's not as overtly active. So you either play down, you publicly change, you get on board with the government because you need those businesses. I've never seen a yellow hotel. You see yellow hotel workers, but no hotel in their right mind is going to say, we support the protests, because they cannot survive without travelers from mainland China. I don't even know if most of the hotels will survive.
Okay, thanks for that. We have time for maybe a question or two. Let's go to the next question. I see a hand up from Matthew. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I was just curious from the point of view of the Hong Kong protest movement, if there's a preference for the victor of the 2020 US election.
Yeah, Alex, you want to go first? I have things to say.
Sorry, is it about the US election, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. From your point of view, do you have a preference on who wins, Biden or Trump?
Oh wait, is our question, do we have a preference, or what is the preference of the Hong Kong people or the protesters? That's a different question.
From the protesters, but I suppose if you want to share your opinion, that's fair game too. Yeah, from the protest movement.
I cannot.
You want to go first, Susanna?
I will go. So yeah, I think many of you might have heard about that book. What was the title? What's Wrong with Kansas? I don't know if you know it or remember it. But the theme of that book was that Americans oftentimes vote against their better interests. And I see that in some ways with Hong Kong. I see this real presentism with young Hong Kong protesters, very, very eager to have Trump win, because this idea that Trump is hard on China, and they love the sanctions. They wanted the sanctions. They want the international world to recognize that that China has been taking away their rights for years. I don't think there's an understanding of what Biden represents and an alternative that could, an alternative to Trump's tactics and how that could help them. Interestingly, I did have a conversation yesterday. He's not a Hong Konger, but he's an immigration lawyer who spent a lot of time in China and Hong Kong. And he's very encouraged by the Kamala Harris membership on the ticket, on the Democratic ticket, because he feels like if Biden wins and they stop the investigation of the Huawei heir, and there's no more demand by the U.S. government for her extradition, that may release the two young men who were, they've both been convicted, or one of them's been convicted, I can't remember, in China. And that may start to ratchet down this kind of, tit for tat is a terrible word. It's more like blow for blow. That's been happening between Western nations and China. So I don't know if there's a sense among older Hong Kongers, if they can see that way down the line. But definitely younger Hong Kongers think that Trump is the best thing that's ever happened to Hong Kong. Alex?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the case. Like for protesters in Hong Kong, what is at stake? The stake is how the new president is gonna develop or position its diplomatic policy towards China. That would be the top priority for Hong Kongers. Surely you could say Hong Kongers they have no stake in U.S. election, but that's their preference. When you ask them who do you support, Trump or Biden? You can imagine you would get probably more positive feedback for protesters who support Trump, but they might not know well about they might not be well versed into the domestic politics in the U.S. So they have a very little understanding about what's going on in the U.S. So their concern is mainly about the diplomatic relationship between China and the U.S. And hence, they will have a lot of concern about Biden, because it seems Biden seems to be a more soft liner, and Biden also said that he might withdraw the tariff imposed on the Chinese government lately, although the aides of Biden withdraw that statement after Biden's interview got out. So people actually are kind of skeptical about what the diplomatic policy of Biden's towards China would be. So that's a huge question mark. Surely some people would say, if Biden become the president, it might open up more room for economic reform domestically in the U.S. And that might help restructure the economic relationship between China and the U.S. in the long run. But it also depends on what kind of economic policy is that, and how do people envision that economic policy, and it is really up in the air.
If I could just offer my 2 cents, I think it's a classic doctrine of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's kind of what we're looking at. So I guess from a short-term transactional standpoint, sure, I think, having one party, be victorious versus other, that might be at least symbolically beneficial, at least perceived as beneficial for those in Hong Kong. But ultimately, I think you have to look at the bigger picture, which is which of the two superpowers, which country needs who more? Is it U.S. needs China more, or is it vice versa? And I think the fundamental question that we have to ask in the U.S. is, are we willing to fundamentally change our economy? Because it's a consumer-based economy. And, for us to dramatically undergo that economic transformation, it's not going to happen. And, unless we're willing to, stop shopping at Walmart for these, cheap manufactured goods, we're going to be, relying and be dependent on China as an economic partner. And China is one thing that they're very good at is looking at the long-term picture, and they could just run out the clock. And the year 2047 is not that far away. So sooner or later, perhaps maybe 5 or so, half a dozen U.S. administrations, and then we're going to get to year 2047. And I think by then, unless if something drastic changes, it's going to be, they're going to enter a new era. And I'm just not sure if it's going to be very positive for those in Hong Kong. That's my analysis. Maybe I could be proven wrong. But with that being said, we do need to wrap it up. So Suzanne or Alex, any final thoughts on today's topic?
I just want to second what you just said. I think that's absolutely right. It really depends on the economic culture and how like the way of living, like how people are gonna like, well, live their life, like where they shop, how do they get their products, how are goods being manufactured, how do people make profit, and whether that kind of economic relationship is sustainable on economic terms and also environmental term. And that is a really pressing issue. And like pessimistically speaking, we could say like perhaps like the worst case scenario would be like, well, business as usual. And we could envision military clash or cyber clash being more and more frequent in the future. That might be one possible scenario. And that is quite convincing that it is going to be the case for people like, well, in this planet, because like perhaps like the leaders, they would not want to change because that might threaten their leadership or their legitimacy to govern. And also like the people who are running the business, they also have a stake. Like, well, they might have to pay a huge cost in transition to another model. So I think this is a really critical juncture that might open up a lot of questions and proposal on like, well, what might be possible and how people are like connected to one another. That is actually, they're actually connected in a very visible sense, not in a very invisible sense. If we could, if in the long run, we could like, well, enhance our understanding about like how the economy and also the way of living is connected through these terms, then we might be able to come up with some new proposal, or at least try to understand the conflict in better terms and come up with alternative and solution. I see that as a way out, like without like a better education to have a better understanding of what is going on. It seems that it would be really hard to like unravel the complexity of what is the stake and why people might react that way, or like, well, whose interest is losing in this conflict, and whether you want to pay the cost or whether we want to like, well, stop the bleeding and come up with new solution. So I pretty much second what Tom just shared.
Not having a big background in economics and looking at the world more politically, I'm really fascinated with how much the Hong Kongers have been reaching out to other movements and other people in other countries that feel like they too are suppressed, they too are being controlled by an authoritarian government. And this goes back to, I don't know who visited who first, but Alex, if you remember, Joshua made a bond with some young people in Ukraine after 2014. And I think one of them came over to Hong Kong, and there was a lot of exchange, and all of a sudden there was the Ukrainian protesters were sharing things about Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was sharing things about Ukraine on Facebook. And this year I've seen this incredible response with Hong Kongers sharing information about Black Lives Matter, retweeting things about Hong Kong, sharing memes and protest tactics and articles about each other, articles that have been done about the two protests, the two movements. Now I see a lot of Hong Kongers sharing things about Belarusia. I'm hearing from some people this desire to make this part of a larger movement. It's not just about Hong Kong and the PRC in their view. This is a global problem where people's rights are getting eliminated by kleptocracies that are controlling every aspect of their life, their ability to make choices, their ability to live well, to get an education, to freely move. And I can't predict this, but I'm fascinated that the attention that they got last year has somehow awakened them to a broader currents in the world. And I don't know where that's going. But I think it's in some ways encouraging, it's healthy as their channels of communication are going to get clamped down because of the PRC's dictates about social organizations and media and education have to be cognizant of nationalist PRC rhetoric. They're reaching out to the other world, the other parts of the world, for their news and their and backing. And let's see where this goes.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. One last thing is like I feel like I treasure the chances of sharing Hong Kong's story in this forum, because I feel like people here, we are all eager to learn more and to understand the world better and to understand the dynamic better, so we could better analyze and position ourselves and to come up with solution that might lead us to a better future. And I feel like people are eager and folks aspire to learn more, to cultivate a more comprehensive understanding, to come up with some system solution that could facilitate change. Because we all could see that the current system is really losing the people, and it is not sustainable. And you could list all the negativities and all the drawbacks of how the existing system actually failed people. And because of the pressing issue, you have more and more people trying to come up with better understanding, to cultivate our understanding, and to make friends with one another. And I do see this as one of the very substantial initiative that people could participate. And this might be so ungrounded and very very naive, but I do see this as a critical component dimension in really supplementing the analysis that we are having right now. I don't see this kind of effort as separating with the ground analysis and all the tools we have and all the practices we're embedded in. But I do see this kind of intention and effort as a crucial component in facilitating coming up with a better world. So yeah, I just want to thank Tom and everyone for being here.
And I second that. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne and Alex, and thanks for being available. I know both of you have a very busy schedule, and what we'll do is we'll post links to the work that you've done or the efforts that you've been involved with on our page so people could follow. And we would love to have you come back. Suzanne, I really enjoyed the discussion that we had on foreign policy as well as kind of the trajectory of modern media. So I'd love to have you come back and talk to us more on that. And Alex, I mean, the Hong Kong situation is going to be ongoing for the foreseeable future. So we'd love to have you come back. Thank you, Anna Chung from HKDC, for putting all this together. And just on a programming note, next Tuesday, August 18th, we're going to have another panel discussion like this. And this one's going to be involving the Uyghur ethnic minority group in Xinjiang province in China. It's a very important issue. In my opinion, it's a situation that could only be described as ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide. And we have two prominent experts in this subject that will come on and speak about this. So hopefully all of you will be interested in joining us next Tuesday at 6:30. So on that note, thanks everyone. Have a good weekend. Enjoy the good weather. Be well.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.